If you've spent any amount of time around livestock or looking into livestock, you'll hear so many people either love or hate goats. Here are 5 reasons why people hate goats, but each one of these could actually be countered as long as you know the behavior and characteristics of goats. Okay, now here is the biggest one, and instead of keeping it until the very end, we're gonna talk about it right here, right in the beginning, and that is number 1. The biggest reason why everybody hates goats is because you can't keep them in. They are known to be escape artists. Now there is actually a lot of truth to this, and let me show you what I mean. Here's something different with like a cow, is that this one single strand hot wire is enough to keep the cows in. It's awesome. They don't like to test it. For the most part, there could be some small reasons why they might push through this, but for the most part, a cow will stay on with this one single strand of hot wire. Electric fencing like this can be an option for goats if they're trained on it from a young age. I've had a little bit of experience with my goats and electric fencing. They were not trained on it, so there are issues in times where they can still knock it over, push it, and escape. So I don't have the best of luck with these, and it's just one thing to remember and to note when you are raising goats. So that being stated, goats need proper fencing. This is the counter to the escape artist. Now, listen, goats are goats, and goats are always going to have the inclination and wherewithal and knowledge to be able to escape wherever they can. And a lot of the times, that's actually not even intentional, because let me show you down here. Now this right here is considered just basic field fencing. I think these are 5x5 squares, and it shrinks down underneath to 2x5, and then gets a little bit bigger all the way up to a 5x5. This isn't recommended for goats because it isn't the strongest and can have issues, kind of like what I had over here at this part. This may be a little bit hard to see through this, but in this one spot down here next to the road, there is lack of a T-post into the ground, making just this one spot a little bit weaker and easier to fold down. Down here, as you can see, the goats like to stand on things and reach up high because these are Nubian goats. So taking that into consideration, you see this? What they'll do is they'll lean on fencing, especially field fencing, and with it woven wire, it can bend. And if it bends and it's not shored up enough, that can be pushed down. And that's when they can lower it enough to jump over. And that's exactly what they did do. So the biggest counter to all of this is just making sure that they have good fencing in the places that they should be at with proper T-post management, because this right here is, I think, 4x4 wire. It's known as goat and sheep fencing. It's woven wire, not welded, because the welds can break. So this is woven, and you can actually see what I mean, how there's other metal wrapping around the metal, so there's no welds in order for them to break. Now let's move quickly and on to the next one, and that is that goats are destructive. And they're not wrong, because goats can be destructive, kind of like what I mentioned before with the fencing. If they lean on the fencing, it can bend over the fencing, make it less appealing visually because you have animals leaning on them, but also, especially with trees. And I've had some issues with this. Goats are high intensive eaters, and they have a lot of demand when it comes to their nutrition. And sometimes, if they're not getting everything that they need from their feed or from their hay, they're going to be searching for those nutrients or whatever they're desiring from something like tree bark. So what they can do, because they have these bottom teeth that they can scrape the plant with, they will scrape up the bark in a lot of these different areas. So I have like 2 layers of fencing. This is their lockup area where I lock them up at night, and if they finish their food at night, if whatever happens, if it's raining and they didn't get out, sometimes they'll come in and scrape up these trees. And if I gave them access to these trees fully, they would kill every single tree. So when they say that they're destructive, they're not wrong. But again, you need to counter that with knowing about the goat. The main times that I need to deal with scarring like this is during winter or the beginning of winter. When we're transitioning off of green natural feed to hay, sometimes they'll go and they'll scar up the trees as they're transitioning themselves into the hay, or if I missed the season just right and they were needing hay before it, because with goats, forage can seem good on the floor, but it's not what the goats want. So it could be a little bit you can misinterpret the signs of where your pastures are going, especially mine. And this is because goats thrive more with roughage more than they do foliage that's just green grass on the ground. They thrive more with rougher, more tough weeds and stuff. So as long as you're bringing in enough hay or food or minerals that the goats need, you shouldn't have the problem with their destructiveness enough, because their mouth feel, them searching around and scraping things, will be spent on eating the hay or the feed that you are providing them. This kind of contributes to some of that myth that goats will eat anything, and it's because goats eat a lot of stuff that a lot of other animals don't. So, like scraping your tree bark, or getting into weird things, or food that other cows won't eat. This contributes to the myth, because if I put something like a tire out here, the thought process is that the goat will eat the tire or the metal can, but they won't. They'll just eat a bunch of nutrients and foliage that normal animals won't, or other ruminants won't. Number 3 on the next of the list, and that is goats are smelly. Again, there is truth to this, but also it's important to recognize that it's not every goat. Male goats have a season where they go into heat. Yes, the male goes into heat, just like the female does. And these male bucks, when they go into heat, this is called rut. And as they go into rut, they give off the most awful goaty smell from these scent glands. And these scent glands cause it to be very attractive to their female counterparts. And it is not very appealing to the human nose. It's not just these sweat glands that cause the issue of smell, though. Male goats, bucks, have an issue where they also make themselves more appealing to female goats, where they provide something like perfume to themselves, and they pee on their own beards. And this also contributes to the bad and disgusting smell. Now, we could take this and know this about goats and consider these options when it comes to what to do about this. For one, we could not keep a buck on at all, and that smell is not around. That terrible goat smell does not exist because there is no buck around. Now, if you do consider on keeping an intact buck around, there's 2 things you could do to help minimize that smell. The first thing is you can bathe your buck, give him a bath. Even though a lot of goats don't like water, still bathing him is going to get a lot of that pee off of his beard. He's just going to pee it back eventually, but regular baths really do help with that smell. It also gets rid of a lot of that, the scent glands that they've put the scent all over themselves, that it helps minimize the amount of those oils that are actually on their skin. So this will help with how much smell is around if that buck is around. Now, the other thing you could do is just try to make sure to keep the buck away from all of the girls, because especially if you're trying to have your goats for milk, having that buck around will help taint the taste of the milk. It will taste more goaty. Without the buck around, I maintain the fact that with proper handling and cleanliness and feed, your goat's milk will taste amazing, and most people will not even recognize the difference between fresh cow's milk and fresh goat's milk. But your buck must be kept away from the rest of those females. Number 4, and that is that goats are loud. Now, about this one, I don't have tons of experience with the fact that goats are loud. I know that goats are loud when they're hungry, when they're stressed, or when they're lonely. Now, when I very first brought goats onto our property, we had 4 of them. Sorry, we had 3 goats. We brought them all on at the same time, and one of them would cry for me continually. I'd be up at my house and she would cry from the barn just to get me to come down and spend some time with her. So I do recognize that goats can be noisy in the fact that they're calling for you, but most of the time, like a baby, like a human baby, if they're crying, it's for a reason. And if you can meet these needs, like hunger or attention or companionship with another goat, they don't make any noise. It's been maybe 2 years, and since I've really heard my goats cry for me, occasionally when I'm not recognizing that down in the pasture they're almost done with their hay bale during the winter, they'll make some cries, but it's an easy thing to rectify. I know what the problem is. They're crying because they're hungry, so I'm going to bring them some more food. But that rarely ever happens because most of the time I'm on top of it, so I don't really even hear them. But I do know that it is an issue that people have, especially I hear it in some of the comments of the other videos I make. A lot of people say goats are loud. And my only experience with that is that if they're not being properly managed, if they're hungry, or if they're stressed, then we have loudness with goats. But the way to fix that is properly fed. Now, for number 5, we actually have another really big claim, and that's that goats are hard to keep healthy. And this is a really big reason on why people hate them. I've become pretty friendly with some of the Amish community out here, and I've spent a lot of time talking to one of the men. And he had a herd of goats that was about 100 strong. Almost every single one of his goats eventually ended up with parasites and died off. He was not managing for their parasite loads. I barely do anything about parasites for them, but I do take some preemptive measures in order to keep parasite loads down in them. Before I tell you that though, the other thing that can go on with goats' health is the fact that they're not getting the proper amount of minerals. They need a high amount of copper and a high amount of selenium. And if they're not getting that in their diet, they can easily take a turn for the worse. So as long as you're providing them good regimens or preemptive regimens for parasites and making sure they get enough copper and selenium, you should have a lot better time with goats and their health. Oh, and before we go on, also making sure that goats' hooves are trimmed, because if not, they can do something that's like being foundered. That's a term that's used for horses, and that's when their hooves start to grow up in the front and they can't walk properly. A lot of the times, if their hooves are not maintained, they're going to start walking on their knees, on either their front or their back legs. This will be a really big problem for them. They can get hoof rot or fungus in their hooves if they're not being properly managed or trimmed. I actually have a video on how to trim them. If you're ever curious and you don't know how to trim your own goat's hooves, or if you're looking into them, check out that video because it's really useful. Now for my goats, because these are milk goats, when they're in milk and we're consuming the milk, we don't necessarily deworm them. And what I mean by that is just nothing that is over the counter. What we do provide for them is wormwood and diatomaceous earth. Now there are mixed reviews on what people say about diatomaceous earth, on whether it works or doesn't work, because some people say that diatomaceous earth does not work once it's wet, but there's mixed research, mixed opinions on this one. I use diatomaceous earth just in case, and just in case diatomaceous earth doesn't work, I will sometimes treat with wormwood. Now when I say treat, I just mean preemptively give them some. It's been 3 years with this set of goats, and I've never had a problem with parasites. I'm always preemptive with the diatomaceous earth and with the wormwood. There's actually something you could do with your goats to check where they are potentially with their parasite load, and that is to pull their eye like this down, look at the flesh underneath the eye, see how red that is. If it is red, that means that they're doing just fine. The more pale it is, it means that the parasites are living inside of their intestines and drawing a lot of the food, nutrients, and blood away from these vital areas. The more pale it is, there is a chart that you can look up. I'll try to provide a link to it in the description. But that will help you know what to do and what steps to take for your goats without ever having to deworm them or anything. Just regiment them and then occasionally check their eyes. Now, I know that there's going to be varying opinions on this topic. Let me know if I missed something, if there's a reason why you hate goats for a different reason. If you love goats and you think I'm wrong about every one of these, let me know your thoughts in the comments. I would love to keep this conversation going. Thanks for watching. Glad to see you. Subscribe, follow along. See you next time.